Welcome to The Story. I'm Tim Gordon, in for Pat Doris tonight. Evan Watson will join us in a few minutes from Salem, where the Oregon Supreme Court heard arguments today over Measure 113, the law that aimed to disqualify lawmakers from re-election if they racked up 10 unexcused absences during the legislative session. But first, part 4 of our series, looking at the Endangered Species Act 50 years after it was passed. Now, so far, we've told you about the trouble facing the northern spotted owl and how its listing helped upend the timber industry. We've taken you to eastern Oregon, where the gray wolf returned after being eliminated more than 75 years ago. And we've shown you how the Pacific salmon, a species with immeasurable importance to the region, has struggled to rebound. But tonight, we're going to take a step back. With all the conflict, protests, fiery rhetoric, and impassioned advocacy, has the Endangered Species Act worked? For all the billions of dollars spent on recovery, are any of these species better off now than when they were first listed as endangered? Environmental reporter Cale Williams took that question to more than a dozen experts.
From the forests of the Coast Range, to the mountains and high prairie, to the rivers that cut through them all, there are few parts of the Northwest that have been untouched by the Endangered Species Act. And anything that far-reaching is bound to rub some folks the wrong way.
Two very fundamental American ideals come crashing together, and one is this concept of Teddy Roosevelt, Wild West, wildlife, preserving that, and private property rights. Private property rights is a very American ideal. And how do you reconcile those two?
That's Paul Henson, who worked as Oregon State Supervisor for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service before retiring recently. In his view,
the ESA, Endangered Species Act, is an unequivocal success.
Right.
And Kim Kratz, who helps oversee salmon recovery for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
I think that the Endangered Species Act has had a pretty significant role in keeping these populations from going extinct.
That's not exactly a surprising take from two people in charge of implementing the act. But Henson explained his reasoning.
It stopped extinctions. It impressed upon the country the need not just to keep species from going extinct, but preserve the habitats, or in the language of the act, the ecosystems upon which they depend.
The romance of pig farming. All right, come on.
But what about the people who share the land with the animals protected under the act?
Come on, pig.
Their opinions are a little more mixed. Here's Rob Clavins, who's been advocating for wolf recovery in eastern Oregon since wolves returned to the state nearly 15 years ago.
The Endangered Species Act has been successful in making species not go extinct. It hasn't been as good at getting species to biological recovery, but to the extent it's fallen short there, it's not because the Endangered Species Act is broken, it's because it's starving. We need more protections for wildlife, especially in an age of climate change and increasing development.
John Williams, who chairs the Wolf Committee for the Oregon Cattlemen's Association, also has his issues with the ESA.
The federal protection that wolves had here, was that successful in your mind?
No. He says the act is a blunt instrument that's been co-opted by special interest groups.
The sledgehammer of the Endangered Species Act has been hijacked by people with agendas, and that's usually when we get bad management.
Looking at the bigger picture and the context.
Danella Miller is the fisheries science manager for the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. As a member of Yakama Nation, she's been working to save salmon for most of her life. And for her, the Endangered Species Act has a ton of promise, but she's still waiting to see it realized.
All of these species listed in the 90s in the Columbia River Basin, how many of those have been restored?
But there have been successes under the Endangered Species Act. Not so long ago, the bald eagle looked to be headed toward extinction. Today, their numbers are close to 300,000.
I see bald eagles flying over my house here, and I'm 2-3 miles from downtown Portland. I see them all the time, and 20 years ago, we thought eagles were also going to go extinct.
The borax lake chub, a tiny fish that lives only in a small lake in Oregon, was listed as endangered in 1980, but removed in 2020 after the land surrounding its home was set aside for conservation. It was the first time a fish had made it off the endangered species list due to recovery. And it's not just birds, mammals, and fish. Nelson's checker mallow, a flowering plant with bright pink blooms native to Pacific Northwest prairies, staged a remarkable comeback and was taken off the list just this year.
Because enough landowners have private landowners have provided habitat for that plant.
There she is.
And there's some cause for optimism for the Northwest's most high-profile endangered species, too. Last month, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service proposed killing roughly 400,000 barred owls in Oregon and Washington over the next 30 years. While that might not be welcome news if you're a barred owl, studies have shown spotted owl populations have stabilized when their larger, more aggressive counterparts are removed. And talks continue around the removal of 4 large dams on the Snake River. Tribes and salmon advocates have been pushing to breach the dams for years to improve prospects for salmon, though many in the inland Northwest have raised concerns about the loss of hydropower, irrigation, and shipping. And for the wolf, the state now feels like the species has reached a big enough population in Oregon to export some wolves. Colorado voters approved a plan to reintroduce the species there, and Oregon will be sending up to 10 of its wolves to the state early next year. But despite the successes and reasons for guarded optimism, the ESA still has lots of room for improvement.
And it's pretty good at keeping the species just hovering just above extinction, but it's not terribly great at recovering species and getting them to be a really healthy population again.
Henson said he'd like to see changes to the act that would prioritize action well before a species gets so close to extinction.
The moment where you'd get the most conservation done is before something's listed, but when a listing is imminent. So how do you kind of impress upon folks you have this urgency, but you don't get locked into an inevitable path of having to list?
And a more proactive approach to conservation will only become more important as climate change and human development continue to increase.
There's too much at stake to allow these to continue to decline and not to invest in a long-term recovery strategies.
Even if that sometimes makes for some difficult conversations.
I think it says something good about us if we can make room on the landscape and in our hearts for all native wildlife, not just to exist, but to actually thrive, and especially those species that challenge us the most.
Well, Cale Williams joins us now. And Cale, a lot of differing opinions in that story, but there have been successes with the act, right?
There have, and the bald eagle is the one that everybody points to. I mean, the bald eagle was headed towards extinction, at least down here in the lower 48.
Right.
There's lots of them up in Alaska. And the main threat that it was facing was DDT. That's an insecticide that was outlawed. So the fix for that was pretty simple. You outlaw DDT, bald eagles bounced right back. The issues facing some of these other animals are a lot more complex. As we saw with salmon, they're facing threats, from their headwaters up in the forest, past the dams, all the way out to the ocean. Right. So much more complex issues.
Right. So we talked about salmon and wolves and the spotted owl. But give us kind of the bigger picture. There's a lot of species out there in our world.
There are, and 1,300 of them, more than that, are protected under the Endangered Species Act, which is good. But not all of the news is good. I mean, there are some scientists who think that we are entering what they call a mass extinction event. This would be the 6th one. The last one took out the last of the dinosaurs. And so species go extinct naturally. They think it's about 1 in 10,000 species every 100 years. And it looks like there's evidence that we are surpassing that rate at this point. And they think a lot of that has to do with human actions. These are things like pollution, the way that we use land is changing, invasive species, and of course climate change, which multiplies all of those things. And so that sounds like really bad news, and it kind of is. Sure. But if you think about it, if humans are causing all those things, humans also have the power to stop doing those things.
Yes, we do. All right. Well, Cale, what's on tap for tomorrow?
Tomorrow, we are going to hear from you guys, from our viewers. You guys have been sending in questions and feedback all week. We're looking forward to reading it, answering some of those questions, and we do have some sort of breaking news on some of these stories. Just this week, there was a lawsuit filed in Colorado that they're hoping to block the wolves that are supposed to be reintroduced there that would be coming from Oregon. And just today, just a couple hours ago, the Biden administration released a plan that appears to lay the groundwork for breaching some dams on the Snake River to help salmon.
Wow, and that is big news. These are great stories. Thanks, Cale, very much. And now it's your turn. What do you think about the Endangered Species Act? Did you hear anything this week during Cale's series that surprised you? Maybe something that changed the way you think about a certain species or work being done to prevent extinction? Let us know. Email the story at kgw.com or call and leave a voicemail, 503-226-5090. Now let's take a look at some of your thoughts following Kale's segment last night, looking at Pacific salmon. Thousands of people have already watched it on the KGW YouTube channel. And now's a good time to remind you that if you've missed any of his series this week, you can catch them all on YouTube. Well, Larry had this to say last night. For decades, indiscriminate harvest for 10 months occurs in Alaska and Canada, sells 50 to 60% of our adult Chinook. Big Chinook, vulnerable for several years, are rare from long-term vulnerability. Smaller fish leave fewer eggs, never gains back. We are fools trying to overcome the obvious. Just working on what isn't wrong has gone insane. Well, several of you shared concerns about overfishing, including Greg, who wrote, "There is commercial overharvest in our ocean. Foreign countries, along with Alaska and Canada, overharvest many of our fish returning to Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Management needs to curtail the harvest." And how about this from a YouTube viewer saying states should do a better job regulating seasons? I'm a commercial salmon trawler and avid sports fisherman in the Pacific Northwest, and it's frustrating watching our commercial seasons close but leave the estuary fisheries open. I understand that the rivers that are open have maintained a healthy stock of salmon, so they allow harvest on those rivers. But if there's a lack of salmon on the coast, maybe we should give the river systems a break. And many of you have honed in on the dam and hatchery aspect of the story. Kale shared how hatchery salmon have altered genetics, giving them a lower chance for survival. And if those hatchery salmon breed with the wild salmon, those genes are passed down. One indigenous tribal member told Kale that hatchery salmon are smaller than their wild counterparts. And a viewer on YouTube wrote, "Disagree in part on what was said about hatcheries not making a difference. Hatcheries are the reason any fish are still here on dammed up rivers and rivers or creeks with highways on them. Until the dams go and habitats are intact, hatcheries are the best choice, in my opinion, to keep salmon and steelhead around for cultural purposes, economy, and for the enjoyment of recreating." And finally, a viewer who did not leave us a name wrote to us, "Sure, in a perfect world, most of the dams would not be there, but with our population, how would we raise enough food without irrigation? How would we generate enough power to heat houses and run cars? And all we would need is more trucks because they could not navigate the river, not to mention the recreation." Hey, thanks for sharing your thoughts with us, and keep them coming. During tomorrow's show, we will feature more of your opinions, and Kay will be answering some of your questions. So if you've got something simmering on your mind, send it our way right now. Just email the story at kgw.com. Up next on the story, the Oregon Supreme Court heard arguments today over a lawsuit involving Measure 113, the law that was meant to keep lawmakers off the ballot the next time around if they walked out of the legislative session. But several GOP senators contend that the measure's wording means something very different from what voters thought it was meant to do. Evan Watson explains when the story returns. Welcome back. It's a story that we've been following for more than a year now, Oregon's Measure 113. Voters overwhelmingly approved it last year with more than 68% of the vote. The thought was that it would discourage political walkouts by forcing lawmakers to basically press pause on their political careers for at least one term if they walked out. But then we saw the longest walkout in Oregon history, and many Republicans involved took to the courts to challenge the language in the law that more than 1 million Oregonians approved. Today, the state Supreme Court heard arguments in the case. Evan Watson brings us the highlights from Salem.
Lawyers for a group of Republican senators and the Secretary of State presented their arguments to the Oregon Supreme Court today. Now the justices will decide whether a legal loophole in the wording of Measure 113 should allow the senators to stay in office for years to come, or whether they should be punished now for the walkouts this summer. One sentence, part of the actual text of Measure 113, could be enough to save Republican senators' political futures. That sentence, for the term following the election after the member's current term is completed. Senators believe that any disqualification from office would apply years from now, because elections take place before terms end.
You should adhere to your precedents. You should not construct a new rule. And you should basically allow the legislature or the voters to fix the problem.
Senator Tim Knopp is one of the senators challenging the Secretary of State's ruling, barring him from running again in 2024.
I don't think that the state really has much of a leg to stand on here, because the Secretary of State, through the DOJ, is interpreting this measure to mean something that it doesn't say.
Measure 113 was intended to dissuade senators from walking out on the job, stopping all legislative sessions without a quorum.
The ballot title caption, for example, which appeared literally right above the yes and no bubbles that voters filled in on their ballot, was unambiguously clear that this measure applied, that this disqualification applied for these legislators' next term of office.
But the attorney for the senators told the Supreme Court the ballot explanation got it all wrong.
These were just explanatory tools, and you know what? They were wrong. The arguments in the ballot title sold this measure based on certain assumptions that were wrong.
The Secretary of State's attorney argues it matters what voters read on their ballots.
Why should we treat those as more significant?
The reason why this court does not interpret constitutional text in isolation is because there is a significant risk that in doing so, it will subvert clear voter intent.
Although he admits the actual wording as it stands in the Oregon Constitution doesn't look great.
There are plenty of provisions in our Constitution that are worded much more poorly than this one. And yes, this is clunky. This is inelegant. I'm sure the drafter wishes they could get a mulligan on it. But it still is enough to articulate what the voters were trying to do here.
Now Supreme Court justices will decide the senators' futures after they racked up more than 10 unexcused absences during the walkout this past summer.
Chief Justice, you asked, why did nobody notice this at the time? This was vetted by a lot of people. It went through a ballot title process, the voters' pamphlet statement. Nobody mentioned this until after the 2023 walkout was already underway. And I think that's telling.
So the big question, when will justices make their decision? A source with the Justice Department told me the expectation is that they'll fast-track this decision because of the impact it could have on upcoming legislative races. And Senator Tim Knopp himself says he expects to know by March when he would need to refile for the upcoming election in November. So the general consensus is by sometime in February, if not before. In Salem, Evan Watson, KGW News.
Well, thanks a lot, Evan. Now let's talk about another controversial ballot measure, 110. It decriminalized user amounts of hard drugs with a consequence that many see as more of a suggestion rather than an actual penalty. If someone is caught with hard drugs, police can give them a citation that includes a $100 fine, or the person can call a phone number to try and connect with treatment. We've told you before how many police officers feel that giving those tickets is really a waste of time, and it's a sentiment we heard again yesterday.
What we're seeing out here, the level of fentanyl addiction and the control fentanyl has over people is immense. And the idea that we're going to give people a business card to follow up the next day, when frankly all they're thinking about is how to maintain and not get sick from withdrawals. It's just, I feel like that's unrealistic.
And the Measure 110 hotline for people to call has not been ringing off the hook, so to speak. OHA says that since 2021, only 577 people called the line, and of those, less than half were calling because of Measure 110 tickets. But now OHA has revamped that hotline, apparently with hopes that it will be used more. A Boston-based nonprofit called Health Resources in Action took over as the hotline contractor, replacing Lines for Life. The new group operates helplines in 3 other states, Massachusetts, Illinois, and Vermont. Their 18-month contract with the state of Oregon is worth more than $2.8 million. They plan to enable texting to the hotline and will come up with a new website for support, as well as making follow-up calls to ensure that people get help. And because a new company took over, well, there's a new phone number now. It's right there on your screen. It's 1-833-975-0505. The previous helpline phone number will continue to operate, but will funnel people into this new number, which we'll give you one more time, 1-833-975-0505. Well, coming up next on The Story, we'll take you to Portland's Old Town, where a new storage space just opened up. It's meant for the belongings of homeless people, especially with the city's daytime camping ban poised to take effect if a ruling that's blocking its enforcement is overruled. Blair Best explains when The Story returns. And now to the homeless crisis in Portland as rules and restrictions around unsanctioned camping ramp up, at least in theory. Many on the streets are struggling to find a safe place to leave their things. But a new storage space just opened up in Old Town, a hub for the homeless. As Blair Best reports, it's giving people much more than just a place to put their things.
Daniela and Mitchell are used to watching the city pass them by,
Constantly feel stuck.
as their every move is calculated.
And it's heavy. I gotta carry so much weight. Sometimes I'll miss meals and stuff because it's just too much weight to get there.
I mean, nobody wants to carry around everything they have on their back, you know?
Some relief is finally here. Across the street on Northwest 5th and Gleason is a new place for homeless people to store their things during the day.
Kind of lighten the burden, too.
It opened this week. John was one of the first to take part.
Just dropping off a few clothes, like just things that I don't want to have to tote around during the day.
Giving him the freedom to take on other tasks.
Going to the Central City Employment Center, take care of that. Dentist appointment, I gotta find a dentist.
The city of Portland hired Central City Concern to run the new storage space. It's open 7 days a week from 7 in the morning to 8 at night. Outreach workers will be on site 2 days a week, connecting people with services.
Having this storage environment just a block away is really an answer to our prayers.
Scott Kerman runs Blanchet House, a popular day center in Old Town.
I think it's going to be a much more dignified environment for people to store their belongings, which is really crucial.
Now, this green shipping container under the steel bridge and along the waterfront is where homeless people used to store their things. But now it's upgraded to that larger building in Old Town. And come December 18th, this will no longer be here. A handwritten sign warns people that they have less than a week to move their things.
It used to just be bags in a cubicle. Now they give you a container to put it in, but the container happens to be a garbage can.
So anything that can relieve stress off the community would probably help.
All right, now let's not forget that with that old storage facility here along the waterfront came drug use and lots of unsanctioned camping. People are hoping that won't be the case with the new site, seeing as Central City Concern will be working with the homeless people and providing people low barrier job opportunities. And again, there will be outreach teams on site. Blair Best, KGW News.
Thanks, Blair. Well, that's the end of our show. Thanks so much for watching. The Good Stuff with Brittany Falkers is coming up next. And be sure to tune into The Story tomorrow night for the final installment of Kale's series on the Endangered Species Act, including answering some of your questions. So we'll see you then. Have a good night.